Welcome, seekers of forgotten myths. You are now entering the world of epic relics, where legends breathe again, and where the whispers of the past echo into our present. Today, we will unravel the tale of a creature both strange and fascinating, one that dances between the realms of human and beast. Half wild spirit, half reflection of our deepest instincts, the satyr. To the Greeks of antiquity, satyrs were far more than comic tricksters. They were companions of Dionysus, the god of wine, intoxication, and ecstasy. They were wanderers of the forest, hunters of nymphs, keepers of lust, musicians of frenzy. They embodied that which could not be tamed, the chaotic pulse of nature and the untamed desires hidden in every human heart. The story of satyrs is not a simple one. It is not only about laughter, not only about lust. Their image and meaning have shifted through the centuries, at times symbols of fertility and joy, at times warnings of excess, at times demons of temptation, and at times mirrors of human freedom. In this journey, we will explore the satyr in all its layers, from its earliest origins in Greek myth to its role in Dionysian rituals to its place on the stage of ancient theater. We will see how philosophers, artists, and poets interpreted them, sometimes as monsters, sometimes as teachers, sometimes as shadows of ourselves. And in the end, we will ask, why has the satyr never truly disappeared? Why does this figure, half man, half beast, still haunt art, literature, and imagination, even in the modern age? Prepare yourself. This is not just a tale of a mythical creature. This is a tale of the human spirit itself, the battle between reason and instinct, order and chaos, laughter and fear. This is Epic Relics, and this is the story of the Satyrs.
The first question is simple. Where did the satyrs come from? In the mythology of ancient Greece, satyrs were not gods, nor were they ordinary mortals. They belonged to a class of beings called daimones, spirits of nature that stood between gods and humans. The Greeks saw the world as full of hidden forces, and satyrs were one of them. Wild, unpredictable, always tied to the earth itself. Early depictions show satyrs as hybrid beings. Their upper bodies were human, but with tails, animal ears, sometimes even horse-like features. Later, under Roman influence, they would merge with the Italian faun, becoming more goat-like, with horns and cloven hooves. Yet the essence remained the same. Satyrs were the personification of the wilderness. They lived in forests, caves, and mountains, far from the walls of cities. They were believed to emerge at night, dancing under the moon, drinking wine, chasing nymphs, and playing music that stirred both joy and fear. But satyrs were not just party spirits. Their existence symbolized something deeper in the Greek worldview. The Greeks believed that human life was always caught between order, represented by the city, law, and the gods of Olympus, and chaos, represented by the wild, the earth, and instincts. Satyrs belonged entirely to the latter. They were not evil, but they were dangerous. They embodied the power of desire, fertility, and excess. In agricultural society, fertility was life itself, but unrestrained fertility could also bring destruction. The satyr thus became both a blessing and a warning. Over time, their myth grew richer. Some said they were followers of Dionysus from the very beginning, born from the earth to serve the god of wine. Others claimed they were children of Hermes, the trickster god, or of Silenus, the drunken teacher of Dionysus. Their origins shifted depending on the storyteller, but their essence never changed. They were, above all, nature itself in human form, untamed, instinctive, free. And that is why the Greeks both feared and celebrated them. To look at a satyr was to see the side of humanity that could not be polished away: lust, laughter, and madness. It was a mirror of what civilization tried to suppress, but could never fully destroy. Thus, from their very birth in myth, satyrs were not minor figures. They were shadows at the edge of Greek thought, constantly reminding mortals of the wildness inside them. If there is one god most closely bound to the satyrs, it is Dionysus, the god of wine, ecstasy, madness, and divine intoxication. Dionysus was not like the other Olympians, where Zeus ruled the skies with thunder and Athena presided over wisdom and cities. Dionysus belonged to the wilderness. His realm was the vineyard, the festival, the torch-lit procession. And wherever Dionysus appeared, the satyrs followed. They were his companions, his entourage, his ever-present chorus of wildness. With him they danced through forests, carrying wineskins and flutes, shouting and laughing until the night itself trembled. In vase paintings, Dionysus is almost never shown alone. Around him always appear satyrs and maenads, the women who worshipped him in frenzied devotion. To the Greeks, this union of god and satyr carried a deep meaning. Dionysus represented ecstasy, a state where mortals leave behind their normal selves and become something else, something divine. Satyrs, with their unrestrained lust and endless thirst for wine, embodied this very idea. They were not only companions of the god, they were his living symbols. The Dionysian festivals of ancient Greece made this connection clear. During these celebrations, wine flowed endlessly, people wore masks, and the lines between man and god blurred. Actors in goatskins danced as satyrs, reminding the people that beneath their civic identity, they were still creatures of instinct. But this ecstasy was never without risk. Just as wine could be sweet or deadly, Dionysus could bring joy or madness. And the satyrs, ever unruly, represented that dangerous edge. They were the laughter that could turn into violence, the dance that could spiral into chaos. This is why philosophers and poets often treated satyrs with both fascination and caution. They reminded humanity that freedom and desire were divine gifts, but when unleashed without restraint, they could consume everything. In this balance between joy and ruin, the satyrs lived eternally at Dionysus's side. They were his shadows, his mirrors, and his warning. To follow the god of wine is to risk becoming like them, wild, ecstatic, untamed.
But satyrs were not the only followers of Dionysus. Alongside them danced the maenads, mortal women transformed by divine madness. The maenads, whose name means the raving ones, abandoned their homes, their families, their duties to roam the mountains in frenzied worship. They wore crowns of ivy, carried the thyrsus, a staff tipped with pine cones, and in the grip of Dionysus performed acts of both wonder and terror. Some myths describe them nurturing wild animals, others tearing men limb from limb in ecstatic fury. The satyrs and maenads together formed the Dionysus, the sacred procession of Dionysus. They danced, drank, and shouted in unison, the boundaries between male and female, human and divine, dissolving into frenzy. Yet, the relationship between satyrs and maenads was not equal.
While Maenads were often depicted as holy devotees chosen by Dionysus, Satyrs were portrayed as lustful pursuers. On countless vases, we see Satyrs chasing after the Maenads, trying to seduce or seize them. Sometimes the women resist, sometimes they fight back, sometimes they dance along. This tension carried symbolic weight. It reflected the constant pull between uncontrolled desire and sacred ecstasy. The Maenads represented divine inspiration, a madness that connected mortals to the gods. The Satyrs, by contrast, embodied the earthly side of that madness: lust, intoxication, physical hunger. In some stories, the Satyrs succeed in their pursuit. In others, they are punished, mocked, or humiliated by the Maenads. The message was clear: not all madness is equal. Dionysus granted ecstasy as a divine gift, but when it descended into mere lust and violence, it became dangerous, shameful, destructive. And yet, the two could never be separated. Satyrs and Maenads together created the rhythm of Dionysian worship, one side divine, the other earthly, one lifting toward the heavens, the other dragging toward instinct. For the Greeks, this pairing was a reminder. Every sacred celebration walks the line between worship and chaos. Every ecstatic vision can become a descent into madness. And in that fragile space, Satyrs danced eternally beside the Maenads, partners, rivals, reflections.
If we wish to understand the role of Satyrs in Greek imagination, we must step into the theater, the beating heart of ancient culture. Greek drama was not merely entertainment, it was ritual, philosophy, and community woven together. And at its center stood the worship of Dionysus, the god to whom the theater itself was dedicated. Every spring, during the city Dionysia in Athens, citizens gathered to watch plays that explored the nature of humanity, the gods, and the fragile line between order and chaos. Among the forms of drama, the Satyr play held a special role. After audiences had endured the weight of 3 tragic plays, grim stories of heroes, curses, and fates worse than death, relief came in the form of comedy. And that comedy was provided by the Satyrs. In these plays, the chorus was made up of actors dressed as Satyrs, shaggy costumes, horse or goat tails, padded bodies, and grotesque masks with leering smiles. They danced, they sang, they mocked. They turned the gravest of myths into playful, bawdy parodies. Imagine a tragedy about Heracles descending to the underworld. In the Satyr play that followed, the same hero might stumble drunkenly as Satyrs pestered him, tripping over their hooves and cracking crude jokes. The gods, kings, and monsters of myth were dragged down into the mud of laughter. This was not blasphemy. To the Greeks, it was balance. Tragedy revealed the greatness and suffering of mortals. Satyr plays reminded the audience that life was not only solemn. The laughter of the Satyrs was a release valve, a way to keep despair from crushing the human spirit. Scholars suggest that tragedy itself may have grown out of these Satyr choruses. The word tragodia, goat song, may even reflect the Satyr's origins and performance. In a sense, the theater was born from the hooves and laughter of these wild creatures. Through drama, Satyrs became more than myth. They were voices on the stage, bridging sacred ritual with human comedy. They allowed the Greeks to laugh at the very myths they revered, without ever losing their reverence. And so, in the flickering torchlight of the Athenian stage, Satyrs lived again, not as shadows in the forest, but as masks, music, and endless laughter.
Beyond the theater and the festivals, Satyrs carried a deeper meaning. They were the embodiment of the wild instinct that lay within every human being. To the Greeks, civilization was fragile. Cities, laws, philosophy, all were carefully built structures that kept chaos at bay. But just beyond the walls lay the wilderness, the forest, the mountains, the uncharted places where instinct ruled. Satyrs belonged to that realm. They were not gods, yet not fully beasts. They stood in the twilight between man and nature, half tamed, half feral. Their hooves beat to rhythms older than law. Their laughter pierced the silence of sacred temples. They were reminders that no matter how polished humanity became, there was always something untamed beneath the surface. In their endless thirst for wine, the Greeks saw human appetite. In their lustful chases, they saw desire unchecked. In their wild dances, they saw the part of the soul that longed to break free of order. Philosophers wrestled with this symbolism. Plato and others often contrasted the rational soul with the irrational impulses that drove men to folly. Satyrs embodied that irrational side, the impulses society sought to control but could never truly destroy. Yet, the Greeks did not depict satyrs only as shameful. There was also joy in their chaos. They sang, they danced, they lived without fear of tomorrow. They had no need of politics, no hunger for power, no fear of death. In a way, they were freer than men. This duality is why satyrs endured as symbols. They could represent danger, the collapse of order into madness, but also liberation, the release from the burdens of control. They were warning and temptation, mirror and shadow. Even their connection to music reflects this truth. The flute, the pipes, the drums, these were not instruments of order like the lyre of Apollo. They were wild, hypnotic sounds pulling listeners out of themselves. Music of the satyrs was not harmony, it was frenzy. In them, the Greeks acknowledged something universal, that every human carries the wild inside. To deny it is to lie. To embrace it blindly is to fall into ruin. But to understand it, to dance with it without being consumed, that is wisdom. The satyrs, half man, half beast, were not simply mythological figures. They were lessons carved into flesh and horn. They were eternal reflections of the human struggle between civilization and instinct.
But though the satyrs could be playful and even comical, there was always a shadow that clung to them. For beneath their laughter, there lurked a darker truth. Satyrs were not always harmless. In many stories, their lust was not simple desire, it was dangerous, even violent. On vase paintings, we often see satyrs chasing after women, their faces twisted in grotesque hunger. Sometimes the women resist, striking them with torches or fleeing into the woods. These scenes captured an uncomfortable truth. The satyrs embodied not only joy and freedom, but also the threat of desire unchained. The Greeks knew well that unchecked lust could destroy lives, families, even cities. By exaggerating these impulses in the satyrs, they held up a mirror to humanity's own darkest instincts. It was not only lust that gave them their shadow. Their drunkenness too carried menace. Wine in the hands of Dionysus was a sacred gift, but in the hands of satyrs, it became an endless thirst, a spiral into chaos. Drunken mobs, after all, were not far from riots. The satyr reminded Athenians that the line between celebration and destruction was frighteningly thin. And then there was their laughter. Though it could bring relief, it could also humiliate. The satyrs mocked kings and heroes, stripping them of dignity. In the theater, this was comedy, but in myth, it was also a reminder that reverence could quickly become ridicule. There are darker stories still. In some late traditions, satyrs are no longer playful companions, but predatory demons, haunting lonely travelers in the night. Their goat features grow more monstrous, their eyes more cruel. These later depictions reveal the lingering unease they inspired. In all these ways, the satyrs stood at a dangerous boundary. They were not villains, but they were not safe. They embodied the truth that pleasure can turn to pain, joy to ruin, ecstasy to violence.
This dual nature is why they fascinated the Greeks for centuries. To laugh at the satyrs was to laugh at one's own shadow, but to fear them was to fear the chaos that lurked inside every human heart.
Myth is never still. It shifts and changes, reshaped by the cultures that inherit it. And so it was with the satyr. In the earliest Greek traditions, satyrs were wild, bestial, grotesque. They had tails, hooves, snub noses, leering faces. They were far from noble. They were comic and crude. But as centuries passed, their image began to transform. One source of change was the influence of the Romans. When Rome absorbed Greek culture, it also absorbed the satyrs. But the Romans already had their own woodland spirits, the fauns. These beings were gentler, more pastoral, less threatening. In Roman art, the two often merged until satyr and faun became nearly indistinguishable. This blending softened the satyr's image. Instead of terrifying figures of lust, they became rustic companions of nature, symbols of fertility, guardians of the forest. The darker edges of Greek myth blurred into something more idyllic. Later still, in the Renaissance, artists rediscovered the satyr, but they reimagined him through their own ideals. Painters like Titian and sculptors of the Italian courts depicted satyrs as muscular, handsome figures, half man, half goat, but often heroic in form. Their grotesque qualities gave way to sensual beauty, reflecting Renaissance fascination with the human body and its desires. By the time of Romanticism, the satyr had transformed again. Poets and artists saw in him not danger, but freedom. He became a symbol of escape from rigid society, a child of nature untamed by human laws. Where once he represented threat, now he was inspiration, a call to return to the wild. And yet through all these transformations, the satyr never lost his essence. He was always half human, half beast, always the embodiment of instinct and appetite. Whether feared or celebrated, mocked or admired, he reminded each age of what it most desired and what it most feared. From Greek tragedy to Roman pastoral, from Renaissance art to romantic poetry, the satyr endured. He shifted in shape, but his hooves still echoed through the centuries. A timeless figure, changing with every age, yet always carrying the same truth, that the line between man and beast is never as firm as we believe.
The satyr may have been born in the shadowed forests of ancient Greece, but his legacy stretches far beyond. In medieval Europe, echoes of the satyr survived in stories of horned demons and trickster spirits of the woods. The wild, goat-legged figure became a convenient shape for the Christian imagination to give to temptation itself. Where the Greeks saw laughter and danger, the Middle Ages often saw sin. Yet not all traditions cast him in darkness. In folklore across Europe, rustic nature spirits, Pan in Arcadia, fauns in Rome, and wood woses in the north, carried something of the satyr's spirit. They were guardians of wilderness, protectors of fertility, reminders that the land was alive and untamed. In art and literature of the Renaissance, the satyr returned not as a demon, but as a symbol of sensuality and pleasure. He danced once more in paintings, played the pipes in sculptures, and whispered in poems. He became both comic relief and allegory, a reminder of the bodily instincts philosophers and priests sought to restrain. In modern times, the satyr has never truly vanished. He appears in fantasy novels, video games, films, and popular culture. Sometimes he is still the mischievous trickster, other times a gentle woodland guardian, or even a heroic figure. His horns and hooves mark him instantly recognizable, his nature endlessly adaptable. But perhaps his greatest legacy lies in the questions he still asks of us. What does it mean to be human? Are we creatures of reason or creatures of desire? Can we embrace our instincts without being consumed by them? The satyr is not merely a myth, he is a mirror. When we look upon him, we see the parts of ourselves we often hide. The hunger, the laughter, the chaos, the longing for freedom. He challenges us to admit that civilization is not the whole story, that within us, the forests still whisper and the hooves still beat. And perhaps in that recognition, we find wisdom. For to deny the satyr is to deny part of ourselves, but to dance with him, to learn his rhythms without surrendering to them, that is to walk the narrow path between order and ecstasy. This then is the satyr's true legacy. Not only a creature of myth, but a timeless reminder that the human soul is never only one thing. It is reason and madness, order and chaos, man and beast, forever entwined.
And so, we come to the end of our journey through the wild, haunting, and fascinating world of the satyr. From the mountains of Arcadia to the theaters of Athens, from the paintings of Rome to the pages of modern fantasy, the satyr has walked beside humanity for over 2,000 years. He has been our companion in laughter, our warning in lust, our shadow in madness, and our mirror in instinct. He is a creature that resists simple definition. At times he is comic, dancing, drunk, and absurd. At other times he is terrifying, predatory, violent, dangerous. Yet he can also be joyous, free, and even wise, teaching us that the wild cannot be denied, only understood. The satyr's horns, hooves, and wild eyes remind us that we are never far from the wilderness, even when we stand in cities of stone. His music calls us to remember that ecstasy and madness are two sides of the same coin, and his laughter warns us that pride, power, and even sacred myth can be mocked by instinct itself. This is why the satyr endures. He is not just a mythological figure of the past, he's a question that every age must answer. How much of the beast lives within us? How much of the wild can we allow before it consumes us? And is there wisdom in learning not to silence the satyr, but to dance with him? Here on EPIC RELICS, we preserve these stories, not only to admire their beauty, but to seek the truths they still hold. For myths are not dead. They're voices that echo through time, shaping the way we see ourselves and our world. The satyr story is both warning and wonder, and as long as humans walk the earth, he will never disappear. His hooves will always be heard in the distance, his pipes will always play in the wind, and his laughter will always remind us, beneath the polished mask of civilization, the wild remains. This was the tale of the satyr, one of the most enduring and provocative creatures of Greek mythology. Thank you for joining us on this journey through myth and memory. If you found yourself captivated, if you felt the forest stir within you, stay with us here on EPIC RELICS, where the voices of the ancient world still speak. Until next time, remember, myths are not only stories of the past, they are reflections of ourselves. And in the reflection of the satyr, we may yet discover who we truly are.